Perhaps geriatric staff should face mandatory cognitive testing before they're allowed near patients. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before a Black Hawk landed in his hospital parking lot. He didn't know. None of them did. They were standing next to a decorated Master Chief Petty Officer, and she was about to save a man's life in ways they couldn't comprehend. But first, he needed to break her. The room went dead silent. Seattle General in San Antonio hums with the particular frequency of 1,000 fluorescent lights running simultaneously, that electric buzz that gets into your bones after the third night shift in a row. Margaret Walsh moves through the cardiac ICU at 6:06 in the morning with the kind of invisible efficiency that comes from 11 years of knowing exactly where every supply lives, which monitors have the sticky buttons, which resident physicians will panic if you don't guide them through the first venous access. Her scrubs are navy, unremarkable. Her hair is pulled back so tightly it makes her temples ache, and she's learned this is a feature, not a bug. Tight hair means you don't catch the attention of surgeons who mistake competence for insubordination. The morning smells like coffee and the particular chemistry of wound irrigation fluid, something between copper and antiseptic, a smell that doesn't bother her anymore because she's smelled much worse. The cardiac floor at Seattle General holds 12 beds, and Margaret has been present for 317 deaths in this unit alone. She's kept count. Pain is data, and data is what keeps you alive. Room for 07 has a post-operative patient, a man named Admiral Porter, though Margaret doesn't know that yet, and even if she did, she wouldn't acknowledge it. She changes his dressing with movements that could be measured against a metronome. 16 seconds to remove the old gauze. 3 seconds to assess the incision line. 12 seconds to apply the fresh dressing. 47 seconds total. She's done this dressing 14 times in the last 6 hours and will do it 14 more times before the shift ends. The incision is healing cleanly. Good perfusion, minimal seeping, no signs of dehiscence. Her hands move like tools, efficient, bloodless in their precision. The day shift arrives at 7 a.m. With them comes Dr. Raymond Caldwell, cardiac surgeon, board member, the kind of man who wears his reputation the way other men wear cologne, visible from 3 rooms away. He has a jawline that could cut glass and the particular posture of someone who has never once questioned whether he belonged in a room. He moves through the cardiac ICU like a landowner surveying property, and the residents trail behind him like satellites caught in his gravitational field. There are 3 of them this morning. Margaret notes this fact without any particular emotion. Caldwell stops at room for 09. The patient is a post-op bypass case, 3 days out, vital stable, pain controlled, trajectory toward discharge. Margaret is in the process of charting when she hears Caldwell's voice, not loud, but the kind of quiet that demands attention. Who ordered the heparin bolus on this patient? One of the residents steps forward. Young, nervous, the kind who still believes there's a right answer to every question. I did, sir. Based on the dosage calculation? Caldwell interrupts. He's already looking at the chart, his eyes moving across the numbers with the speed of someone who's been doing this for 30 years. A pause stretches. Then, this is wrong. Margaret doesn't look up from her charting station. The keyboard clicks softly as she types discharge instructions for room for 10. Her shoulders are level. Her breathing is even. But her peripheral vision has narrowed to a point. The PT ratio suggests a higher bolus. Caldwell continues, his voice carrying the tone of a professor speaking to a particularly slow student. A more experienced clinician would have caught this immediately. Fortunately, I was here. The resident's face goes red. Margaret can see this in her peripheral vision, the particular shade of embarrassment that comes from being corrected in front of peers. She keeps typing. The keys click like a metronome counting down to something she can't yet name. But then Caldwell turns, and his eyes land on Margaret's charting station. Although, he says, I notice Margaret may have also reviewed this. Margaret. It's the first time he's ever used her name. She knew his 3 years ago. She's written it on patient orders approximately 2,000 times. She turned slowly from her station, her expression neutral, the kind of neutrality that costs nothing to perform. The dosage was appropriate, Margaret says quietly. Her voice is the kind that makes people lean in, which means Caldwell leans in. The PT ratio was elevated at intake. Baseline aspirin, plus warfarin from his previous AFib diagnosis, plus the post-op state. A standard bolus would have elevated INR to 8.3, possibly 8.5. She pauses. The residents are very still. The calculation I provided accounted for the drug interactions. Warfarin, aspirin, and clopidogrel interaction with unfractionated heparin. Standard pharmacokinetics. She places the clipboard down slowly. The resident's dosage was the correct dosage. The silence lasts exactly 3 seconds. Then Caldwell's jaw tightens, just barely, just enough to show that something inside him has shifted into a different gear. I see, he says quietly. Well, thank you for clarifying. He walks away. The residents follow. But Margaret knows something has changed in the architecture of the hospital. She's become visible. Visibility, in her experience, is always dangerous. The morning continues. Vitals checks, medication administrations, 2 admissions, 1 transfer to the step-down unit. By noon, Margaret's shift is almost over. 8 hours down, 16 to go until the next night shift. She moves through the hospital like water flowing around rocks, present everywhere, permanent nowhere. She pulls her break time at 1:16 p.m., which gives her 13 minutes before the day shift truly takes over the evening rotation. The break room smells like old coffee and the particular despair of a refrigerator that hasn't been cleaned in 3 weeks. Margaret pours herself a cup of the day-old brew and stands by the window that overlooks the parking lot. Below, she can see physicians getting into cars that cost more than she makes in 4 years. She can see orderlies smoking cigarettes by the loading dock. She can see the ordinary machinery of a hospital running like a body's circulatory system, everything moving, nothing changing. She's drinking the coffee and thinking about nothing in particular when footsteps approach. Caldwell enters the break room like he owns it. He moves to the vending machine and studies the options with the intensity of someone making a much bigger decision. Margaret doesn't acknowledge him. She sips her coffee and looks back out the window. You know, Caldwell says, inserting a dollar bill into the vending machine, I've been thinking about something. Staffing ratios, experience requirements, that kind of thing. He pauses as a bottle of iced tea falls into the collection bin. Perhaps geriatric staff should face mandatory cognitive testing before they're allowed near patients. Safety protocol. Nothing personal, of course. He's not looking at her. He's collecting his bottle and turning toward the door. But he's said it loud enough for everyone to hear, 2 other nurses in the break room, the dietary tech restocking the refrigerator, the physical therapist in the corner doing paperwork. He said it in a way that couldn't possibly be about anyone but Margaret. Margaret stands very still. Her cup stops halfway to her lips. The fluorescent light hums overhead like an insect trapped in glass. She can feel the attention in the room shifting toward her like a tracking device. The other nurses are suddenly very invested in their meal prep. The dietary tech is making a point of opening the refrigerator with tremendous focus. Margaret places her cup down on the counter. She turns to look at Caldwell. The dosage was correct, she says quietly. And it always will be. She walks past him toward the door. Her movements are controlled, measured, the opposite of the shaking that might be happening somewhere else in her body where no one can see it. She doesn't hurry. She doesn't look back. She pushes through the break room door and walks down the corridor toward the time clock. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part is what happens when she gets home to the apartment she rents for herself and her 12-year-old daughter, an apartment that's too quiet during the day when her daughter is at school and her ex doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. The worst part is that she goes directly to her bedroom, drops her bag on the floor, and opens the bottom drawer of her dresser. The boots are exactly where she left them. Combat boots, desert tan, worn at the heel and scuffed across the toes. They've been sitting in this drawer for 7 years, untouched, wrapped in a plastic grocery store bag that has yellowed with time. She pulls them out slowly, like they're something that might break, and sits on the edge of her bed in her dark bedroom, the curtains drawn, the afternoon light completely blocked out. The dust is still there. Actually embedded in the treads, ground into the fabric, the particular tan that comes from Baghdad. She can see it without touching it. She can see the salt stains from sweat that soaked through everything in that heat, see the small pebbles of gravel that worked their way into every crevice and stayed there like memories you can't shake. She runs her thumb over the rubber sole, over the place where the edge is starting to separate from the leather. The boots are falling apart. They're supposed to be falling apart. They should have fallen apart 14 years ago. She sits in the dark for a long time. Her daughter is at school. The house is completely silent. Outside, San Antonio is living its ordinary life, traffic on the highway, the distant sound of a lawnmower, someone's music playing too loud from the apartment next door. Inside this dark bedroom, Margaret Walsh sits with her boots and remembers a different version of herself. The image comes without warning, not a thought, but a flash of muscle memory. She's carrying something heavy. No. She's carrying someone. A man's weight across her shoulders, his arm around her neck, his blood mixing with her blood in that particular way that happens when you've been moving too fast and the cuts haven't even registered as pain yet. Pain is data. They're moving through rubble and small arms fire is cracking overhead like someone breaking branches, and she's counting steps. 3 miles. 3 miles in 34 minutes. She can feel every second of it. The memory releases her slowly. Margaret is back in her dark bedroom, sitting on her bed, holding the boots. Her breathing has gotten heavier without her permission. She doesn't cry. She hasn't cried in 15 years, and she's not going to start now. But her hands are shaking, not from fear, but from something else. Something much older. She sits there for 20 minutes, holding the boots. 20 minutes of nothing but darkness and dust and the memory of being someone else entirely. When she finally puts them back in their plastic bag and returns them to the drawer, her movements are mechanical, practiced. She's done this before. She can do this again. That night, she'll be back at Seattle General for the night shift. She'll move through the cardiac ICU with the same invisible efficiency. She'll take Caldwell's insults and his corrections without flinching. She'll be exactly what everyone needs her to be, competent but deferential, skilled but silent, present but never noticed. But the boots are upstairs now. Not in the drawer anymore. Sitting on a shelf in her closet. Within reaching distance. And tomorrow, there's going to be a man in room 407 whose heart is going to stop beating for 7 minutes. And Margaret is going to have to decide whether to stay invisible or finally become visible again. The Grand Rounds Amphitheater at Seattle General held 23 medical students and residents, their white coats arranged in ascending rows like a surgical hierarchy made visible. Dr. Caldwell stood at the center, his tailored suit a deliberate contrast to the standard-issue hospital wear surrounding him, holding Margaret's charting above his head like an exhibit in a courtroom. The fluorescent lights hummed their clinical song as he began to speak. This, he announced, his voice carrying the practiced projection of a man accustomed to being listened to, represents outdated nursing practices. Notice the excessive detail. The defensive overcharting. Hallmarks of a generation that never learned efficiency. He turned a page, shaking his head with theatrical disappointment. 3 young doctors smirked. One took notes. Another whispered something that made his neighbor's shoulders shake with suppressed laughter. Margaret stood against the back wall, positioned where she'd been taught to position herself years ago, invisible, professional, complicit in her own diminishment. Her jaw muscles tightened imperceptibly. Just a flicker. The kind of muscular contraction only someone trained to hide response would recognize. Her hands found their way behind her back, clasped at parade rest, the stance of someone who'd stood at attention for ceremonies and debriefings and boards of inquiry. She caught herself and immediately uncrossed them, letting them hang at her sides like a nurse who'd never learned any other way to hold herself. She showed nothing. The mask stayed in place. The risk, Caldwell continued, warming to his audience like a performer recognizing applause, is that this level of over-documentation creates liability. It suggests the nurse doesn't trust the physician's judgment. It's defensive. It's inefficient. And frankly, it's beneath the standard we maintain here at Seattle General. He looked directly at Margaret for the first time. His eyes passed over her face, cataloguing her composure, finding no reaction to weaponize. The absence of visible hurt seemed to irritate him more than tears would have. The presentation lasted 7 more minutes. Caldwell cited 3 additional entries from her charts, each one meticulously detailed, exactly the kind of documentation that had saved lives, that protected patients, that represented professional excellence elevated to an art form. He dismantled them methodically, turning her competence into a liability, her care into a character flaw. The residents took notes. The students exchanged glances that said they understood the lesson, deviate from protocol, and you too would be held up as a cautionary tale. Margaret's breathing remained steady. In. Hold. Out. The rhythm of someone who'd breathed through worse than this. Much worse. The kind of worse that came with shrapnel and blood loss and the knowledge that one wrong breath would alert an enemy to your position. This was embarrassment. This was professional humiliation. This was a man in a suit playing power games in a hospital that paid her $74,000 a year to know better than to react. When the grand rounds concluded, she turned and walked out with the same pace she'd maintained entering, neither rushed nor leisurely. Professional. Neutral. The kind of composure that made people underestimate her. 2 days later, she approached the vending machine at 2:08 p.m., during the shift change when the hallways thinned and conversations carried farther than they should. Her hand had just closed around a packet of black coffee when Caldwell's voice rose from 6 feet away, aimed not at her directly but into a cluster of colleagues, a rhetorical tactic designed to ensure his words reached her while maintaining plausible deniability. Speaking of cognitive decline, he said, his tone conversational, almost friendly, I wonder if we should implement mandatory mental acuity testing for nurses over 50. Patient safety, you understand. Can't let sentiment override competence. He pulled his selection from the machine, a plastic bottle of expensive sparkling water, the kind that cost 4 times what regular water cost and signaled the drinker's awareness of their own sophistication. We can't have people making critical decisions when their neural pathways start deteriorating, can we, colleagues? The 4 physicians around him made noncommittal sounds that might have been agreement or amusement or the particular discomfort of people who recognized a bully but lacked the spine to interrupt one. Caldwell paused, turning slightly. Nurse. He made a show of searching his memory, his eyebrows drawing together in exaggerated concentration. I'm sorry, what was your name again? It wasn't a genuine question. It was a rhetorical device weaponized. The name he'd read on her charting, the name he'd presented to his residents, the name he was performing not knowing. Margaret's hand didn't waver as she completed her transaction, inserting her coins with mechanical precision. The machine hummed and dispensed. She retrieved her coffee with the same steadiness a surgeon brings to a suture, turned, and walked past Caldwell with her eyes fixed on a point 3 feet beyond him. Her face remained a perfect mask, not angry, not hurt, not visibly affected by anything that had just transpired. But the resident beside Caldwell laughed, a bright sound like breaking glass, and the echo of it followed her down the hallway like something she could actually feel. That night at home, in the darkness of her apartment, Margaret retrieved the boots from the back of her closet. Combat-worn. Desert-colored. The leather cracked from heat and age, the laces frayed, the sole separated from the heel on the left boot. She sat on the edge of her bed, eyes closed, and ran her thumb over the fine dust still caught in the treads, Baghdad dust, 15 years old, a geography of memory she'd been told never to acknowledge. The texture was familiar. Granular. Like time compressed into particles that refused to settle. Her hand started shaking then. Not from fear. Not from humiliation. From something deeper, the tremor that comes when you've held yourself so tightly for so long that the muscles simply forget how to release. The tremor of restraint finally reaching its limit. She set the boots beside her on the bed and stared at them in the darkness until her breathing steadied again. The next morning, she learned that Caldwell had been assigned as the operating surgeon for Admiral Porter's cardiac procedure, a routine mitral valve replacement. The surgery was scheduled for 0600 hours, and Margaret found herself assigned to the post-operative recovery unit, the cardiac floor where she'd spent the last 11 years, where she knew every monitor configuration and every medication interaction and every way a patient could fail despite everyone's best efforts. She read the name on the surgical schedule and her coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips for just a fraction of a second. Porter. Admiral James Porter. Retired Navy. The name was familiar in the way certain names become familiar when you've spent 15 years not allowing yourself to think about them. Admiral Porter arrived in recovery at 1,430 hours, still drowsy from anesthesia, his chest wrapped in gauze and surgical tape, monitors arrayed around his bed like technological sentries. He was grey-haired, early 60s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in sun and salt and the particular exhaustion that comes from command. A navy ring sat on his ring finger, gold and onyx, the insignia worn smooth from years of contact. Margaret checked his vitals with professional distance. Blood pressure stable. Heart rhythm regular. O2 saturation at 97%. She adjusted his full rate and noted the numbers in the digital record, the documentation that had become her liability, her sign of incompetence, the evidence that she didn't trust the system to work without her careful attention to detail. Porter made polite small talk as she worked. He mentioned the surgery had gone smoothly. He asked about the weather. He told a sanitized story about a deployment to Baghdad, the kind of story military officers tell when they're trying to connect with healthcare workers, professional, approved, the version of the past that fit in an unclassified briefing. Margaret adjusted his oxygen tubing and offered minimal responses. Professional. Efficient. The nurse version of strategic silence. Then Porter rolled up his hospital gown sleeve, reaching to adjust the fabric, and Margaret caught sight of his forearm. The ink was faded, 15-year-old tattoo in military stencil letters. Walsh. Below it, coordinates and a date, 2009. The year. The location encoded in numbers. The name that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. She understood then that memory doesn't work the way governments claim it does. It doesn't obey orders. It doesn't stay buried just because you're told it's classified. Porter noticed her noticing. His eyes met hers, and something shifted in his expression, not recognition, but the particular attention someone brings when they sense information without being able to consciously access it. Looking for someone, he said quietly. 15 years now. Person who carried me 3 miles through enemy fire. 2 bullets in her back. Record says she never existed. He paused, studying her face. Military keeps good secrets when they want to. Margaret's face remained neutral. The mask held. Your fluids are running behind, she said. I'll increase the rate. She adjusted the 4-pump, and the mechanical beep shifted to a slightly faster rhythm. Then she walked from the room with measured steps, her shoes making the particular sound on the tile that all nurses' shoes make, a small whisper of rubber and dedication. But in the supply closet 3 doors down, she leaned her back against the cold metal shelving, closed her eyes, and breathed deliberately. In through the nose. For counts. Hold for 7. Out through the mouth for 8. The tactical breathing she'd been taught to use in high-threat situations, the pattern that keeps the brain oxygenated, the technique that keeps panic from overriding protocol. She was still breathing that way when the alarm started. The cardiac monitor beeped its steady rhythm at 2:16 a.m., the sound that had become the soundtrack to Margaret's nights for the past 11 years. Admiral Porter slept in the semi-darkness of the ICU recovery bay, his chest wrapped tight, the sternum incision already showing the faint bruising that came with post-operative swelling. A routine night. The kind that meant Margaret could move through her shift with the invisible efficiency she'd perfected over a decade, present but unremarkable, competent but forgettable, exactly as she'd trained herself to be. His vital signs were textbook perfect. BP 118/74. Heart rate steady at 68. O2 sat 97% on room air. She checked them every 2 hours with the precision of someone reading instruments that mattered more than breath itself. The surgical notes indicated a clean procedure, valve replacement, no complications. Dr. Caldwell's surgical team had moved through it like a well-practiced orchestra. Porter would be transferred to the step-down unit by morning, probably discharged by the end of the week. A clean recovery. The kind that let Margaret do her job and disappear. She didn't acknowledge the tattoo. That faded lettering on his forearm, the name inked in letters that had survived 15 years of sun and salt water and the kind of living that wore most things away. Walsh. Her hands didn't hesitate when she adjusted his when she checked his dressing, when she documented his vitals in the electronic chart. Her face remained professionally neutral, the mask she'd worn so long it had become her actual face. Admiral Porter, recovering from routine cardiac surgery, deserved a competent night nurse who followed protocol and asked no questions. That was what she gave him. The night stretched quiet. 3:15 a.m. The ICU hummed with its familiar orchestra, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms in adjacent bays, monitors beeped their steady announcements that hearts were still beating, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the sound of tired electricity. Margaret moved between rooms with the economy of motion that came from muscle memory older than her civilian life. Check fluids. Verify settings. Document findings. The dance that kept people alive without anyone knowing they'd been dancing. Porter woke briefly around 4 a.m., the way post-operative patients did, emerging from the fog of anesthesia in disoriented fragments. His eyes focused on the ceiling, then tracked left toward her as she entered to check his morning labs. She said nothing. He said nothing. Two people sharing oxygen in a small room, separated by years and secrets and the deliberate architecture of anonymity she'd built brick by brick since the day she'd stepped into civilian life and promised never to surface. She was the nurse. He was the patient. That was the entire story anyone needed to know. His recovery progressed with the kind of textbook precision that should have been boring. Should have been. 18 hours post-op, his vitals remained stable. The surgical dressing stayed dry. His pain was manageable, he declined the stronger medications, something about preferring clarity, which made her pause for one fractional second before she continued her work. She'd known men like that. Men who'd rather feel everything than float through recovery. Men who'd been trained to trust their own perception more than pharmaceuticals. The kind of men who'd survived impossible things and didn't want to miss a single detail of waking up again. By 6:15 p.m., when the day shift nurse came to take her report, Margaret had nothing significant to document. Stable night. Vitals unremarkable. Dressing dry. Pain well controlled. No new complications. The handoff was crisp and professional. The day nurse nodded, already reviewing the chart, and Margaret changed out of her scrubs in the locker room with the same methodical efficiency she applied to everything. Her shift was done. Porter was healing. Everything was exactly as it should be. She was pulling on her jacket when her phone buzzed. A text from Emma's school, some permission slip she'd forgotten to sign, something about a field trip. Ordinary problems. The kind that belonged to normal people with normal lives. She'd learned to collect these small normal moments like other people collected photographs, proof that she existed in something resembling a regular existence. She texted back that she'd handle it, and by the time she walked to her car, she was already mentally transitioning into mother mode, the self that was allowed to exist outside these walls. She never made it home. The emergency call came at 9:43 p.m., while she was 3 miles away, heading west on I-37. The hospital operator's voice was clipped and urgent, a triage alert that meant something had deteriorated. Margaret was off the clock. Margaret was done. Margaret was someone else's problem now. But her hands had already moved to turn the car around before her conscious mind caught up with the fact that she was driving back towards Seattle General, navigating the dark parking lot, climbing the stairs to the cardiac floor with the stride of someone who'd never actually left. The monitor was screaming when she pushed into Porter's bay. Not the calm beeping of normal rhythms, but the frantic wail of alarm, the sound of a heart in chaos. The sternum incision was dehiscing, the wires pulling apart as his chest heaved, as his body tried to compensate for a heart that had begun to fail. Ventricular fibrillation, the monitor's readout screaming across the screen in patterns that spelled catastrophe. His eyes were open, aware, that moment of clarity when the body knows something is ending before the brain can quite process it. The code team wouldn't arrive for another 7 minutes. She knew this. She'd timed it, the way she'd timed everything at Seattle General. The response window, the elevator times, the distance from the crash cart to this particular bed. She looked at Porter once, at the fear in his eyes, and watched it transform the second he saw her. Recognition, impossible and undeniable, a man remembering the hands that had carried him through Baghdad dust and incoming fire, the voice that had kept him moving when every nerve ending was screaming to stop. She didn't reach for the code button. The alarm was already sounding, alerts already going out. Instead, she pulled on gloves, the snap of latex like a gunshot in the suddenly small room, and moved to the crash cart, hands moving with a kind of precision that didn't come from nursing school. She'd prepped for this her entire career without knowing it, the way a soldier preps for war every single day of peacetime, hands ready for something civilians couldn't imagine. The sternum was already separated. She pulled the wires apart with surgical precision, her movements efficient and calm, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. His chest opened under her hands like muscle memory written in anatomy. She positioned herself, found the angle, and began direct cardiac massage, her hand compressing his failing heart with the exact rhythm and pressure of someone who'd done this before, under fire, with rounds overhead and nothing but training and necessity keeping her moving. 7 minutes of perfect silence. 1 breath. 2 compressions. The heart responding to manual pressure, to the intervention that shouldn't exist in civilian protocols, to the technique that belonged to Black Ops extraction teams and combat medics working in active fire zones. She maintained his output with a kind of focused intensity that made everything else in the hospital cease to exist. Porter's eyes stayed on hers, and she saw the moment something shifted in his expression, not fear now, but the terrible clarity of recognition, of understanding that he was being held alive by the woman he'd spent 15 years searching for. The ICU floor had entered into the hallway, faces pressed against the glass of his bay window. A resident frozen in the doorway, watching something that wasn't supposed to be possible. Nurses with their hands over their mouths. The silent observation of people witnessing something that violated every assumption they'd made about hierarchy and training and what a night shift nurse was supposed to know. She was still maintaining cardiac compression when Dr. Caldwell pushed through the crowd, his face cycling from confusion to shock to something darker, something that looked like a calculation happening in real time. She kept working. Her hands kept moving. Her focus never wavered from the failing heart beneath her palms. The surgical team arrived at exactly the 7-minute mark, and Margaret transferred the procedure seamlessly, stepping back with her scrub soaked in blood, her hand steady as she stepped away from the bed. Caldwell's eyes followed her, tracking the movement, his mind clearly assembling pieces that didn't fit into the world he understood. She could see him working through it, could see the moment something clicked behind his eyes, the moment he recognized what she'd just done and understood that it was impossible. The sternum cracked like ice under her palms. Margaret didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission. The resident frozen beside Porter's bed was still processing the flatline when her hands moved on their own. 15 years of training that supposedly never happened took over. She broke the ribs back open with the precision of someone who'd done field surgery in the dust and dark of Fallujah, who understood that protocol dies when the patient does. The resident stared. You can't. Margaret was already inside. Direct cardiac massage. Her hands, scarred, steady, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of a trauma surgeon who'd learned her craft in a war zone, gripped the ventricles directly. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Not the textbook compressions taught in certification courses. This was something else. This was muscle memory forged in combat. "O2," she said, her voice dropping an octave. Not a question. A command. The resident scrambled. Nurses appeared through the glass partition like ghosts, their faces pressed against the ICU window. Through the walls of the cardiac unit, they could see what was happening. A nurse in scrubs with blood to her elbows, performing a technique that belonged in a field hospital in Kandahar, not Seattle General's sterile recovery floor. The head trauma surgeon, Marcus Chen, 32 years in the operating room, watched from the hallway and went very still. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The monitor showed nothing. No response. No electrical activity. Just the flat line of death in green digits across a black screen. Margaret's shoulders moved with the compression rhythm, economical and absolute. Every movement telegraphed combat efficiency, the kind of efficiency that kept soldiers alive when helicopters couldn't reach them for 40 minutes. Her breathing never changed. Her jaw never clenched. The only indication that her world was collapsing was the intensity of her focus, the way the blood on her hands didn't seem to register as a problem requiring a solution. To her, this was information. This was data. This was a man whose name was sewn into her forearm in faded ink and whose face she'd carried through 3 miles of enemy fire. For minutes. 5. The resident was calling for the surgical team, his voice rising toward panic. Code Blue, Caldwell, where is Caldwell? Margaret didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge the resident's existence. The world had narrowed to the space between her hands and the heart that wouldn't beat. 6 minutes. 7. The surgical doors exploded open. 4 surgeons in scrubs appeared with the defibrillator cart, with the speed of people who'd been in the building when the alarm went up. Dr. Chen was leading, his face already reading the scene, already understanding that something impossible was unfolding in his ICU. Margaret stepped back without being asked. She released the heart with the same composure she'd used to hold it. The surgical team surged forward, but not before every person in that room, every nurse, every resident, every orderly who'd crowded the glass to watch, saw her hands drop to her sides. Saw the blood. Saw the way she stood without trembling, without the shock that should have accompanied what she'd just done. The surgical team took over the resuscitation. Chen glanced at Margaret once, his eyes meeting hers for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to recognize that he was looking at someone who'd done this before. Long enough to understand that before had nothing to do with civilian medicine. Margaret removed her gloves. Turned on the sink. Washed her hands with the methodical precision of someone conducting a ritual. The warm water ran pink, then clear. She didn't look at anyone. Didn't acknowledge the whispers already spreading through the ICU like contagion. Didn't notice the resident staring at her as if she'd just revealed herself to be something other than human. By evening, Dr. Caldwell had made his 3 phone calls. The board members he contacted were men who understood leverage, who knew how to read a situation and identify threats to institutional hierarchy. Caldwell's voice on those calls was measured, professional, edged with concern. Unsanctioned procedures, he said. Techniques that violate protocol. Credentials that don't add up. We need to be very careful about liability exposure. By morning, he'd contacted Margaret's nursing school references, 3 professors, all retired, all happy to speculate about a student from 12 years prior. Caldwell hadn't asked direct questions. He'd phrased everything as concern. Was there anything unusual about her academic record? Any gaps? Any inconsistencies? The professors, flattered to be asked their expert opinion, found themselves speculating about something they couldn't quite remember, and their uncertainty became Caldwell's ammunition. By noon, the formal investigation was open. Caldwell had brought in an outside compliance team he'd worked with before, men in suits who moved through bureaucracy like sharks through water. They arrived with folders and laptops and the kind of authority that doesn't require explanation. Credential fabrication, the lead investigator told Margaret when they found her on the cardiac floor. We need to review your background materials. All of them. Security walked her to her locker. Security walked her out of the building. Her badge was confiscated at 1:27 p.m. on a Tuesday, while afternoon light slanted through the ER windows and the ambulances continued their endless rotation of arrivals. Margaret didn't speak. Didn't argue. Couldn't argue. What would she say? That she'd received an honorable discharge that doesn't exist in any database? That her records were classified? That 15 years ago, a Navy captain had told her in a windowless room at the naval station, you disappear into civilian life and you never surface. You never use your training. You never contact anyone from your unit. As far as the world is concerned, Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh died in Baghdad. She'd agreed because they promised it was the only way to keep Emma safe from the blowback that followed any extraction that went sideways, any mission that officially never happened. She drove home in silence. Her Honda, a silver 2008 with 187,000 miles and a rental car aesthetic, smelled like the coffee she'd made that morning 18 hours ago when she believed she had a career. The scrubs were still on her body. Still had Admiral Porter's blood on them. The smell of antiseptic and iron and her own sweat clung to the fabric like evidence. Her daughter Emma was at the kitchen table when Margaret walked through the door at 4:15 p.m., 2 hours earlier than any Tuesday in memory. Emma looked up from her algebra homework, her eyes registering something wrong in the shape of her mother's silence, in the way Margaret moved like an automaton through the kitchen. Mom. Margaret sat down in the chair across from her. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From the after effect of holding a man's heart in her palms and not being able to explain to anyone, not to the surgeons, not to the investigators, not to the hospital, why she'd known exactly how to save him. From 15 years of containment finally fracturing. Emma left her math on the table and crossed to her mother, small arms wrapping around shoulders that had once carried a wounded admiral through Baghdad's Jolan district under fire from 3 directions. It's okay, Mom. We'll be okay. Margaret's shoulders began to shake. Not a sound at first, just the physical collapse of someone whose world had been systematized into 2 boxes, the civilian box and the ghost box, and both of them had just exploded simultaneously. Emma pulled a chair close and sat beside her, holding her mother's hand like a tether to something solid. Mommy made a mistake at work, sweetheart, Margaret managed. Her voice cracked on each word, that combat-trained composure finally breaking in front of the only person she'd built a life for. A really big mistake. By evening, the emails started arriving. Her nursing license under review. 3 former colleagues contacted for character assessment. A forensic audit of her credentials initiated. All of it moving with the precision of someone who'd orchestrated it methodically, someone who understood that the best way to bury a person wasn't with violence, it was with bureaucracy. Margaret sat at the kitchen table until midnight, coffee cold beside her, combat boots placed upright on the chair across from her like a visitor who wouldn't leave. Those boots, with Baghdad dust still caught in the treads. Those boots that held the last day she'd been herself, the last day before disappearing into Margaret Walsh the nurse, Margaret Walsh the civilian, Margaret Walsh the woman who didn't exist in any official record that mattered. She stared at nothing and waited for the phone to ring, knowing it would. Knowing that 15 years was a long time to keep a secret, but not long enough to prevent it from detonating. The clock on the stove read 11:02 p.m. when her hands finally stopped shaking. By then, she'd already made the decision. She would sit with this. She would absorb this. She would not fight back, because fighting back would require revealing what she was, and revealing what she was would destroy the life she'd built. She didn't know that 23 minutes away, in a secure military office in San Antonio, a message had already been sent through channels that shouldn't have been used. A message that said, Angel 6 has been compromised. Identity exposed in civilian location. Recommend immediate extraction. She didn't know that the response had already come back, authorization confirmed. ETA 600 hours. She didn't know that by dawn, everything would change again. The rotor wash hit like a physical force. The Black Hawk descended through pre-dawn darkness, its searchlight splitting the Seattle General parking lot into stark white and shadow. Rotors screamed. Debris scattered across employee vehicles, papers, leaves, a nurse's lost ID badge tumbling across asphalt like a playing card in a hurricane. The helicopter settled. Its skids touched concrete at 05 for 7 hours. The noise didn't stop. It just hung there, a wall of sound that made the emergency room windows vibrate in their frames. Armed personnel in Navy fatigue stepped out first. Not security contractors. Not hospital police. Actual military, 14 of them, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of operators who'd trained for situations like this one. They formed a perimeter around the main entrance, each one standing at parade rest, their presence turning the lobby into something that resembled a stage set for a play nobody had rehearsed. The morning shift arriving through the side entrance stopped. Stared. One of them pulled out her phone before thinking better of it. 2 officers walked through the front doors. Not the enlisted personnel. Officers. One wore the shoulder boards of a full commander. The other had the bearing of someone used to giving orders that didn't require repetition. They approached the security desk where Marcus, the overnight guard, was halfway through his thermos of coffee that tasted like burnt metal and regret after a 12-hour shift. "We're looking for Master Chief Walsh," the commander said. Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered with the kind of certainty that makes ordinary people step aside without asking why. Marcus's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. "Master Chief, there's no one by that name. We have a Margaret Walsh, she's a nurse, but..." The coat check attendant stepped forward. His name was Paul. He'd been a Marine for 8 years before a roadside IED took the use of his left leg, and he'd worked Seattle General's coat check for 3 years since, because the hospital had been willing to hire him when other places saw only the limp. He wore a pin on his vest, not the coat check uniform, but his own personal pin. A Marine Corps emblem, small and faded. "He means Margaret." Paul's voice carried the weight of someone used to correcting people without malice. "And that's Master Chief Petty Officer, son. You stand when you say it." The commander's expression didn't shift, but something changed in his posture. Recognition. Respect. The kind that travels between people who've worn the same uniform, even if the service branch was different. "Where is she?" the commander asked. "5th floor. Cardiac ICU. Night shift." Marcus was already reaching for the phone, but the second officer, the 3-star from SOCOM, though no one knew that yet, was already pulling a tablet from his bag. He'd done this before. Extraction. Extraction of the classified kind. The kind that left paperwork trails in the government servers but not in civilian ones. The doors to the ICU opened at 0553 hours. Margaret was reading vitals on Admiral Porter's monitor, oxygen at 94%, heart rate steady at 72, sinus rhythm holding like a prayer answered. She'd been checking on him every 30 minutes. Not protocol. Protocol said every 4 hours for post-operative day 6. But Margaret had carried this man 3 miles through enemy fire 15 years ago, and the muscle memory of that responsibility ran deeper than any hospital policy. She didn't hear the boots on tile. Not at first. But she felt the change in air pressure, the way a room shifts when 17 people walk into it at once, when institutional authority materializes in the form of dress uniforms and officer insignia and the kind of collective presence that makes fluorescent lights seem dimmer by contrast. The 3-star Admiral from SOCOM stood in the ICU doorway. Behind him, the commander. Behind them both, Paul, moving slowly on his prosthetic, flanking them like he belonged there. Which, in that moment, he did. Margaret turned. Her hand steadied against the monitor. Her face didn't change. That was the thing people didn't understand about her, the composure wasn't an act. It was infrastructure. Walls built over 15 years, reinforced with every shift she'd worked, every time she'd told herself her name was just Margaret, just a nurse, just someone without a past worth mentioning. The Admiral opened the tablet. His voice was crisp, military precise, the kind of voice that had briefed Joint Chiefs and called in airstrikes. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. 3 combat deployments. Navy Cross. 17 confirmed saves under fire, including the extraction of then Lieutenant Porter and 4 SEALs from a compromised position in the Jolan district, Baghdad, March 2009. He paused. Let the words settle. You took 2 bullets that day. Margaret didn't move. Didn't speak. Her hands were still resting on the monitor, and they weren't shaking. Admiral Porter opened his eyes. He'd been awake for 6 minutes. Margaret had noted it when his heart rate changed subtly, the way monitors speak to people who listen. He lifted his right arm slowly, fighting the post-operative pain, and pulled up his sleeve. There it was. The faded tattoo. Not her real name. The one she'd carried into Baghdad and carried out of it, burned into his forearm in letters that had faded but never disappeared. Walsh. Just that. Just her. His voice broke when he spoke. Not military precise. Not controlled. Just broken. She took 2 bullets carrying me out. 140 pounds of determination with a rifle in one hand and my bleeding body in the other. He was crying now, and he didn't seem to care. 15 years. I've had investigators searching every military database, I thought I'd never find you. I thought you were. He couldn't finish. Margaret moved toward him. Not the careful professional steps of a night shift nurse. Not the deferential posture she'd worn like a second uniform for 15 years. She moved like someone who'd moved through fire zones, and she took his hand, and she held it steady. The Admiral turned to face the cardiac unit's double doors. Toward the hallway beyond. Toward where Dr. Caldwell's office was located. Where he would be arriving within the hour, probably not yet knowing that his world had moved from abstract threat to concrete collapse. The compliance team you hired to investigate Master Chief Walsh. The Admiral's voice could have cut glass. They kept records. Every email. Every instruction you gave them to fabricate evidence. Every directive to find or create problems with her documentation. He paused. Federal investigators have those records now. So do I. So will the hospital board, the medical licensing board, and the United States Attorney for the Western District of Texas. The silence in the ICU was so thick you could operate in it. No monitors beeped. No ventilators wheezed. Even the fluorescent light seemed to hold their breath. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 06 for 3 hours. He was holding a steaming cup of coffee that he wouldn't finish. He was mentally reviewing his schedule, 2 consults, 1 surgery, a meeting with the hospital board at 3 o'clock where he planned to update them on the ongoing investigation into Margaret Walsh's credential fraud. He was thinking about the board members he'd called. The political capital he'd spent. The way those calls had repositioned him as a guardian of institutional integrity. The FBI agents were waiting in his office. Not at his desk, but standing on either side of the door, the way people stand when they're expecting someone to run. Dr. Raymond Caldwell. The lead agent didn't move. Didn't reach for her badge. She was already holding it. We're special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have questions regarding your hiring of Delta Compliance Solutions to investigate one Margaret Walsh, and specifically regarding your instructions to fabricate evidence of credential fraud. Caldwell's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. The liquid sloshed. A few drops fell on his pressed white coat, creating small brown stains that looked like blood. That's a mischaracterization. I was protecting the hospital. Patient safety. The compliance team you hired kept detailed records, the agent continued. Including your emails. Specifically, the one where you instructed them to, quote, find or create problems with her documentation. She held up a folder. Not thick. Just thick enough. They've cooperated fully with our investigation. The coffee cup fell. It shattered against the tile floor, and the sound of breaking ceramic seemed to echo through the entire cardiac unit. They heard it in the ICU. Admiral Porter heard it and almost smiled. By noon, news cameras captured Dr. Caldwell walking out of Seattle General in handcuffs, his face buried in his hands, flanked by 2 FBI agents and a 3rd federal investigator. The images would play on every local news station at 5 and 11. His attorney released a statement about procedural misunderstandings and the dangers of false accusations, but the hospital board voted unanimously by 3 o'clock to suspend him pending criminal investigation. The medical licensing board opened a separate inquiry by 4. His wife's attorney filed for divorce within 48 hours. The man who had wielded institutional authority like a weapon, carefully, methodically, with the precision of someone who understood how hospitals worked, discovered in a single morning what it felt like to fall through the structure he'd mastered. The board members who'd taken his calls stopped returning them. The senior surgeons who'd mentored him suddenly had no comment when reporters asked questions. Residents who'd smirked during grand rounds disappeared into shadowed corridors when he walked past, and then he wasn't walking past anymore. He wasn't in the hospital at all. 6 months later, someone spotted him in a strip mall outside Houston, Texas. 47 miles from the medical center where he'd trained. 302 miles from Seattle General, from the hospital board, from the colleagues who'd watched him be escorted out in handcuffs. He was sitting at a folding table beneath flickering fluorescent lights. No suit jacket. Just a cheap tie and a button-up shirt that didn't fit quite right. He was selling supplemental insurance policies, the kind that people bought when they were desperate or didn't know any better. His medical license was gone. The fraud charges had resulted in probation and restitution, and no hospital in the continental United States would touch him. He handed out business cards to people who didn't make eye contact. He sat there every day except Sunday, from 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, selling policies that most people didn't want, living the kind of anonymous life that most people never noticed. Margaret Walsh didn't think about him. Not once. At Seattle General, on the wall of the cardiac ICU where Margaret had broken open Admiral Porter's chest and held his heart in her hands, they mounted a bronze plaque. The letters were engraved deep, the kind that don't fade, the kind that last longer than careers or reputations or the fragile structures of institutional memory. In honor of Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, USN, who never stopped serving. She returned to night shifts by choice, though the hospital offered her an administrative position. Offered her a leadership role. Offered her an office and the kind of institutional authority that came with a title and a desk. She declined, politely and without explanation. The Admiral didn't push. He understood. Some people aren't built for offices. Some people are built for the work itself, for the quiet hours before dawn when the patients are sleeping and the monitors are speaking their steady language of vitals and vital signs. Admiral Porter visited monthly, attending physical therapy in the same building where she'd saved his life twice. Emma, Margaret's daughter, now 13 years old and suddenly aware of what her mother actually was, wore her mother's Navy Cross on career day. Wore it to school. Carried it into a classroom full of children whose parents were accountants and teachers and software engineers. When Mrs. Patterson, Emma's teacher, asked what the medal meant, Emma held it up to the light and said, simply, "My mom saves people." Margaret kept the combat boots in her locker. Still. After all these years. But now her actual credentials hung beside them, framed commendations that she'd kept hidden for 15 years, that now lived in the small space between her street clothes and the portable defibrillator. On a quiet Tuesday night, a young resident approached her nervously in the break room. Fresh out of his residency program. Eager and terrified in equal measure. "Master Chief," he asked carefully. "I wanted to ask about the direct cardiac massage technique you performed on Admiral Porter. How did you know the exact pressure gradient to?" Margaret cut him off gently. Kindly. "It's just Margaret now. And pull up a chair." She taught him the way she'd been taught, precisely and without ego, the way information was meant to travel, from hands that had done the work to hands that would do it next. In the break room, someone had written on the whiteboard, the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Margaret erased it without comment, but she was smiling as she headed back to the floor, her hand steady, her secrets finally lighter than they'd been in 15 years. If you watched this and thought about someone in your life who's been underestimated, someone quiet, someone strong, someone carrying something you couldn't see, hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story like this one. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever been dead wrong about someone?